At 0612 local time, this Ukrainian MiG-29 pilot was on a mission that was insane, even by Ukrainian standards. A low-altitude strike on a key bridge through the most drone-saturated airspace on Earth. But what he would discover about Russia's newest weapon would change how every air force on the planet thinks about air combat. The mission briefing said this corridor was open. It was wrong. And he was about to find out at 900 kilometers per hour. The MiG-29 roared east so low that the frozen fields beneath him blended into a gray and brown blur. The jet's twin engines howled as he skimmed just above the earth, flying so close to the ground that small hills and tree lines flashed past in seconds. This was the approach phase. First came friendly rear areas, where Ukrainian forces still had control. Then came the gray zone, a shifting stretch of land where control changed by the hour and no one could fully guarantee safety. He had 35 kilometers to the release point. That meant about 15 minutes of very low-level flight through airspace that intelligence officers had studied, that ground controllers had carefully separated from other traffic, and that planners had promised was survivable. But survivable did not mean safe. The sky around him was crowded. Above him, between 100 and 300 meters, Ukrainian and Russian reconnaissance drones were circling, watching every movement across the front. Their cameras fed constant streams of video back to operators miles away. Below him, even closer to the ground at 20 to 50 meters, small FPV attack drones from both sides hunted vehicles and soldiers in a non-stop robotic war. They darted low and fast, looking for anything that moved. The pilot was flying right between these two layers. At 50 meters, he was in the narrow gap in the middle, a temporary corridor where friendly drone traffic had been paused, and enemy activity was believed to be limited. That belief lasted only seconds. His launch warning system suddenly screamed in his headset. The sound was sharp and sudden. It was not the steady pulse of a search radar scanning the sky. It was not the rising tone of a surface-to-air missile locking on. This was different. One short, hard tone. It meant missile guidance was already active. Something had fired at him, and he had never even seen it. There had been no warning. He reacted without thinking. He pulled the stick back and pushed the throttle forward. The MiG's nose lifted sharply as the afterburners flared. G-forces slammed him down into his seat. At the same time, he hit the flare button. Bright flares burst out behind the jet, scattering into the cold air to confuse whatever was tracking his heat. He climbed through 100 meters. Terrain masking was gone now. He was visible. At 150 meters, then 200, he kept climbing, trading the safety of the ground for speed and space to maneuver. He hoped altitude would let him outrun the threat. There was no explosion, no impact. The screaming tone in his headset slowly faded. Whatever had been tracking him seemed to lose lock in the cloud of flares. He was still alive. But now he was at 300 meters, completely exposed, and his radar warning receiver lit up with new signals. To the south, a Buk battery was painting him with radar. To the east, an S-300 system was searching the sky. He had escaped one danger and flown straight into another. Then he saw them. Two shapes, maybe 3 kilometers away, dark against the pale morning sky. They had delta wings and a wingspan of about 3.5 meters. They were not fast. They were circling slowly, almost lazily, but both were turning toward him. Garan 2 drones. The color drained from his face. He had been briefed about this. In December, Russian forces had started mounting old R-60 air-to-air missiles onto their Garan 2 drones. What had once been simple reconnaissance or strike drones were now being used as airborne traps. Their job was simple. Wait in likely flight corridors and ambush Ukrainian aircraft flying low-level strike missions, exactly like his. The R-60 was an infrared-guided missile. It locked onto heat. That meant his radar warning receiver could not detect it before launch. There was no radar signal to warn him. The first missile had come out of nowhere, because it had been dropped silently from a drone that had been waiting for him. The Garans kept turning in his direction. If they had more missiles, he was about to find out. He rolled hard and pushed the nose down, diving while dumping more flares. At 200 meters, he was still too high. The Buk radar to the south continued tracking him, building a firing solution. If he stayed up much longer, that system would launch. But the Durans were above him now. If he went too low, he would give them a clean shot at his engines. A white flash appeared in his peripheral vision. He shoved the stick forward and dove for the ground. The afterburners screamed as the MiG accelerated. Flares streamed behind him like a glowing tail. The R-60s were old missiles with simple seekers. They were not very smart and could be fooled by strong heat sources. He leveled out at 40 meters, so low that he could make out individual fence posts flashing by. His radar warning receiver showed the Buk still tracking but not launching. He had dropped below their effective engagement zone. Terrain blocked their radar. For a few seconds, he was invisible again. Above him, the missile chased bright flares that no longer matched the heat of his engines. A moment later, it detonated harmlessly. The second R-60 had also been fooled. The Durans continued circling overhead. They had no more missiles. They could not shoot him again. But they could transmit his position to other systems. He took a slow breath. He was alive. But his violent maneuvers had pushed him far off the planned route. He was now north of the original corridor, flying through airspace that had not been cleared. His heading was wrong. His altitude was wrong. He keyed his radio for a new vector. The reply came back broken and rushed. Corridor compromised, working alternate, then static. It sounded like ground control was overwhelmed, juggling too many aircraft and too many drones in the busiest battlefield airspace in the world. He checked his instruments and recalculated. The release point was still 22 kilometers to the east. The mission was still valid. He just had to reach it through airspace that no one had mapped for him. He turned east and increased throttle. Then he saw the drones. A stream of FPVs crossed his flight path about 200 meters ahead, flying at nearly the same altitude. They were small, dark shapes against the gray sky. Russian strike drones heading toward Ukrainian positions, or Ukrainian interceptors chasing Russian drones. He could not tell. It did not matter. At 900 kilometers per hour, he was closing at 250 meters per second. There was no time to maneuver around them. He flew straight through. They passed under him, above him, around him. He barely had time to register their shapes before they were gone. Then more appeared ahead. His hands tightened on the controls. This was the nightmare scenario. The sector had become the most drone-saturated airspace in history. On a slow day, there could be 20 FPVs per mile of front line. Right now, it felt like hundreds. He kept going forward because there was no other option. The FPVs were tiny, only about 30 centimeters across. At this speed, they were almost invisible. He was covering the length of a football field every few tenths of a second. If one appeared directly in front of him, he would have time to blink and nothing more. His N019 radar was useless. It was designed to track fighter aircraft, not small plastic drones. His infrared search and track system could not see cold batteries and plastic frames. Every system in his cockpit had been built for a different kind of war. Now his only real sensors were his own eyes, and they were not fast enough. The radio crackled again. Vector 090, heavy activity above 60 meters, stay below 50. He eased the stick forward and dropped to 45 meters. The ground blurred beneath him. At this height, power lines and towers were constant threats. But even worse were the thin fiber optic cables trailing behind some Russian FPVs. Photographs had shown them hanging across ruined buildings like spider webs. If one got sucked into his intake, it could destroy his engine instantly. Another broken transmission came through. Ukrainian interceptors active. Airspace contested. Recommended caution. That meant his own side's drones were now in the sky too, chasing Russian FPVs and adding even more objects to an already crowded environment. Ground control was trying to guide him, but their information was already minutes old. At his speed, minutes might as well be hours. A shadow flashed past his canopy. An FPV, maybe 50 meters away, crossing left to right. He had no time to react before it was gone. Another passed below him, nearly touching the frozen fields. Then a cluster appeared ahead and slightly above, black dots moving against the gray sky. He made a decision. He could not stay at this altitude. Every second down here was a gamble. The release point was still 15 kilometers away, and the chances of reaching it through this swarm were dropping fast. There was only one way out. He pushed the throttle forward past the stop and into full afterburner. The engines roared as raw fuel blasted into the exhaust, turning the MiG into a streak of noise and heat. The jet surged forward, and the G-forces pushed him deep into his seat as speed climbed fast. The airframe trembled with power. Then he pulled back on the stick and began to climb. It was earlier than planned, before the proper release point, before the calculated attack window. But he had no choice. He was forcing his way out of the drone swarm the only way he could, straight up and out, leaving invisible drone threats below and trading them for very visible radar dangers above. A Russian Buk system detected him almost instantly. His radar warning receiver lit up as the Fire Dome tracking radar locked on and flooded him with energy. That beam could guide a missile straight to his cockpit. He passed 500 meters, then 1,000, then 2,000. The radar stayed with him the entire time, calmly tracking, calculating, predicting where he would be seconds ahead. The climb felt endless, but he knew every meter higher made him easier to hit. What he was doing was an old maneuver, something left over from the Cold War. It had been designed decades ago for fighter bombers carrying nuclear weapons that needed to release bombs without flying directly over heavily defended targets. The idea was simple: climb steeply, release the weapons at the top of the arc, and let their momentum carry them forward while you dive away to safety. Pilots on both sides of the Cold War had trained for it endlessly, practicing against imaginary enemies in controlled skies. No one had practiced doing it while being tracked by a live Buk battery and flying through an airspace filled with drones moving at unpredictable speeds. The manuals said this maneuver required a clear threat environment. The manuals had clearly never seen a place like this. He kept climbing. 2,500 meters, then 3,000. The Buk could fire at any moment. If it launched, he might have only seconds to react. But if he stopped now, if he aborted, he would have to fly back through the drone swarm with nothing achieved. The mission still mattered. The bridge still stood. Troops on the ground were counting on him. At 3,500 meters, his tablet showed that release conditions were getting close. The radar was still locked on him, still tracking perfectly. In that moment, he understood something with cold clarity. His life was now a math problem. Could he release the bombs and dive below the radar horizon before a missile reached him? He climbed through 4,000 meters. The display flickered yellow. Close enough. His thumb pressed the weapons release. Two heavy thuds shook the aircraft as the AASM hammer bombs dropped away. But he was already moving. He shoved the stick forward, rolled the jet upside down, and pulled through a brutal split S maneuver that would have gotten him scolded in training. The nose pointed down toward the earth as he traded altitude for raw speed, diving at an angle that pushed the aircraft close to its structural limits. Behind him, the bombs ignited their rocket motors in bright flashes, accelerating toward their target. They streaked forward on their long path to the bridge. Then, the Buk fired. His warning receiver screamed as a 9M317M missile launched somewhere far to the south, blasting off its rail and accelerating to incredible speed in seconds. The pilot never saw it. His eyes were locked on the ground, rushing up toward him. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 3,500, 3,000, 2,500. He was trying to place the curve of the Earth between himself and the radar guiding the missile. The missile used semi-active homing. It did not carry its own radar. Instead, it followed reflected energy from the Fire Dome radar, chasing the brightest illuminated point in the sky. Like a cat chasing a laser dot, except deadly serious. If he could break that radar illumination, the missile would go blind. The only way to do that was to drop below the radar horizon. The missile was closing at around 1,400 meters per second. Distance roughly 8 kilometers. Time to impact maybe 6 seconds, maybe 7. Time for him to dive low enough to hide behind the Earth? The jet began to shake violently, buffeting at the edge of control. At 1,000 meters, he could see individual trees and buildings clearly. Frozen fields rushed upward, growing larger every second. At 600 meters, he started to pull up. The G-forces crushed him, draining color from his vision. But he held the pull. If he leveled too early, the radar would still see him, and the missile would still lock on. At 200 meters, he leveled out and blasted west at maximum speed without afterburner. His radar warning receiver still showed the fire dome searching. Then, suddenly, nothing. He had dropped below the horizon. The radar could no longer illuminate him. 3 seconds before impact, the missile lost lock. Its guidance system tried one last desperate move, climbing slightly and arming its proximity fuse, searching for anything to hit. It found only empty sky. The warhead exploded high above the countryside, fragments raining down harmlessly onto frozen fields. The pilot finally exhaled. He was alive. His bombs were still flying. And now he faced something just as dangerous. He had to go back the way he came. The safe corridor that was supposed to guide him home no longer existed. The only path was west, straight back through the drone swarm he had just escaped. Airspace still crowded with machines he could barely see. He dropped to 40 meters and headed west. 15 kilometers behind him, the two French-made bombs continued their own battle. The AASM hammers had separated cleanly. Their rocket motors burned for about 15 seconds, pushing them to high speed along a long arc toward the bridge. Each bomb was like a combination of 3 systems in one: GPS guidance and laser gyroscopes in the nose, a solid rocket motor in the middle, and control fins on the tail adjusting constantly to stay on course. They were designed to deliver a heavy explosive charge with extreme precision, even from long range. But the designers had assumed a world where GPS signals were reliable. This battlefield was not that world. Russian electronic warfare stations had been jamming satellite navigation across this sector for months. Every precision weapon suffered. Guided bombs drifted. GPS drones lost their way. Even smart artillery shells sometimes missed by wide margins. The jamming was constant and powerful. Inside each bomb, hardened military GPS receivers struggled to hold a signal. They were tougher than civilian systems, built to survive interference, but nothing was perfect. Errors began to build slowly. First centimeters, then meters. The bomb's onboard computers detected the problem and switched to backup logic. Their inertial navigation systems, driven by ring laser gyroscopes, had been tracking motion since before release. They built a picture of position based purely on physics, measuring every movement and calculating where they were without relying on satellites. The trade-off was accuracy. With GPS, the bombs could hit within a meter. On inertial guidance alone, accuracy dropped to around 10 meters. Still deadly, but no longer perfect. Now the difference between a direct hit and a near miss was almost even. Back in the cockpit, the pilot had similar odds as he re-entered the drone swarm. The drones were still everywhere. FPVs moved in patterns that made little sense. Ukrainian interceptors mixed with Russian strike drones, creating chaos layered on chaos. His radio kept cutting in and out. Ground control was still trying to guide him through airspace, changing faster than anyone could track. He did not climb this time. He could not. The Buk had already shown it could track him, and he did not have enough fuel for another full afterburner escape. The only path forward was straight, low, and fast, trusting luck and speed. At 900 kilometers per hour, he covered about 250 meters every second. A drone appearing 500 meters ahead gave him only 2 seconds of warning. Not enough to evade, barely enough to react. His eyes scanned constantly, tracking every shadow and flicker in the gray sky. His hands stayed steady on the controls, but his heart pounded hard in his chest. A dark shape crossed ahead at about 100 meters, then another below him near the frozen ground. He flew straight through and kept going because there was no other choice. Stopping was impossible. Turning was worse. The only direction home was forward. His radio crackled again. Impact in 30 seconds. Track nominal. The bombs were still on course. The bridge was still the target. Somewhere far behind him, 2 weapons were flying through heavy jamming, relying on pure physics and onboard calculation to finish their mission. 20 seconds. An FPV appeared directly ahead, maybe 50 meters away, crossing from right to left. He jerked the stick instinctively, a tiny movement that barely mattered. The drone flashed past and disappeared behind him. He was still alive. 10 seconds. The density of drones began to thin as he approached friendly lines. The radio became clearer. Jamming weakened. Ground control returned with a stronger voice. Roadrunner 24, impact imminent. Stand by for assessment. 5 seconds. At 0617, he crossed into Ukrainian-controlled airspace. He did not see the strike. He was already far away, racing west with low fuel and shaking hands. Behind him, the two AASM hammers hit the eastern span of the bridge almost simultaneously. The first bomb punched deep into concrete before detonating, shattering key supports. The second struck moments later, hitting an already weakened section and finishing the collapse. The span dropped into the frozen river below in a roar of breaking concrete and twisted steel. If you like this video, then watch this one of a Ukrainian MiG destroying a dam. Bye for now.